Again, good evening, everybody. Last week we focused on, well, let me back up here one more step further, just a bit of a review. Here over the past 3 weeks, we focused on some of the precursors, first of all, to the birth of Christ. We focused on the announcement of John's birth, the announcement of Christ's birth, and then the genealogy, the two different genealogies, and why there are two different genealogies and what that meant. And then last week we focused, as we turn to Luke chapter 2, if you want to take your Bibles and turn to Luke chapter 2. I find something interesting here that the first couple of chapters of Luke and the couple of chapters of Matthew actually are where we read about the what would you say, the events and the details of Christ's birth. And really, if you look at Mark and you look at John, you don't read these same details. And the point in that is that for all the to-do about the birth of Christ, that is, of course, that is combined with pagan ceremonies and pagan traditions in the world around us, we don't find that at least two of the authors did not feel that was something that we should celebrate in a special way, and as we don't. We're given no instructions about the celebration of Christ's birth, and so we are given instructions, of course, about his death and the meaning of that, and of course the Passover and all the other holy days of his plan. But we do only find details of surrounding his birth in these two Gospels, Matthew and Luke. Excuse me. So last week we spent some time on the travels of Joseph and Mary from Nazareth to Bethlehem, and looked at a couple of maps, and then the balance of the time on this decree for a census that came from Augustus Caesar. And I honestly, I was not when all was said and done, the reason why it's not actually recorded or it's not posted up there on the along with the other YouTube videos is because I think I actually did a pretty lousy job of it, and was not happy at all with the presentation. And so what I'd like to do, and I meant to do it this week and just didn't get to it, but I plan to do it in the near future, is to do maybe a half an hour review of some of the details and lay out some of the different ideas and that type of thing that I did very poorly last time. So that's why I really don't even want that up there, because it was just not. I'm sorry, but don't think it was well done. And I think it was confusing. So that's why you don't see it there. But if I can give at least a 1 minute nutshell of what in a better way of what was trying to review in all the details and different ideas and explanations, what we find is in Luke chapter 2 and in verse 1 and 2, we read about a census that took place. And the crux of the matter is that the census, as we read here in verse 2, is pegged along with the rulership of a governor, this governor Cyrenius. And so the trick is, or the challenge is, we know from other sources, we can see both from the 70 weeks prophecy, and also which takes us right down to the beginning of the ministry of Christ in 27 AD. And if we go back 30 years, we come to 4 BC. And so 4 BC fits very, very solidly for the 70 weeks prophecy. It also fits with what we read about the building of the temple, and I think I went over that before. The building of the temple, it fits with the date of the Passover in 31 AD, when the Passover would have been appropriately on a Wednesday evening, and then the first day of unleavened bread on Thursday, and then Friday, and then the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath. All those things that 4 BC date for the birth of Christ fits very clearly. And so when we read in secular history that Cyrenius took a census in 6 AD, and that's what's recorded, it can throw a little bit of a shadow of doubt into the everything else that we've learned about when Christ was born. And frankly, the simplest way to address that is actually something from Easton's Bible Dictionary. I might just read this. It's a very brief paragraph here. It says, under Cyrenius, it says, recent historical investigation has proved that Cyrenius was governor of Cilicia, which was annexed to Syria at the time of our Lord's birth. Cilicia, which he ruled, being a province of Syria, he is called the governor, which he was de jure of Syria. Some 10 years afterward, he was appointed governor of Syria for the second time. So in other words, he ruled over Cilicia, was governor of Cilicia, and excuse me, and during that time, he oversaw the area of Judea as well. And that census that we're reading about here, or for example, in fact, some different translations actually help because they address this word in verse 2 when it says this census first took place when Cyrenius was governing Syria. This is Luke 2 and verse 2. That word first can also be rendered formerly. In fact, if you look at, as an example, here's one I should mention to you. In Acts chapter 1, when Luke, actually, of course, who's the author of Acts as well as the Gospel of Luke, in Acts chapter 1, when he tells Theophilus, he says, he mentions the former treatise that he made, which of course he's referring to this gospel here that we're reading, but he says the former account I have given of all these things happening, and then he goes on and he gives the story of the Acts of the Apostles. And so the usage, it's the exact same word, and in that case it's referring not to let's say the first specifically, although it can be used that way, that there are examples where it's of something that happened formerly. And in this case, I think that's the best translation, that there was a former census that was made when Cyrenius was also governing over Judea before he became specifically the governor of Syria that it's mentioning right here. So at least that is a reasonable explanation that fits with everything else that we see that lines up very clearly with Christ's birth being in 4 BC. So hopefully that's a little bit clearer in about 7 or 8 minutes than I did. I went through last week trying to pull all kinds of things together, and I'm sorry, they're not really doing a very good job, I'm afraid. But you see here in verse 3 and verse 4 how Joseph went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea, and we read all this last week. So we review the census in that was where we're at this point. But there are some other very important things that before we just read into the Gospels and start reading into the things that come after here, some very important things as we see Christ's interaction with Satan, the devil, and so on. We're going to come to that very quickly. But I think particularly considering the time of year, I think it's important that we review some of these issues that are really the centerpieces of Christmas, I should say, Christmas celebrations that actually leave a lot to be said. First of all, let's talk about the timing of his birth. Now, we understand that we know he was not born December 25th. Why do we say that? Well, a couple different things. Let's go back, and we're just going to go back between Matthew and Luke here. Matthew and Luke. In this case, actually, let's stay in Luke. Let's read Luke chapter 2 and verse 8. Now we're reading here about verse 6. we read here that Mary's days were completed. And verse 7, she brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. And we're going to address that in a moment and see exactly what that means. But as far as the timing of his birth, let's look at a couple items here. Verse 8, now there were in the same country shepherds living out in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. So this is an indication, the first note that we have regarding when the timing was. And we already mentioned when we looked at the details regarding the birth of John, and then Christ 6 months later, that puts us reasonably right at the time of September, October, right? Let's say at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, frankly, right about the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. And it was in the fall, not in the dead of winter. And in this case, the shepherds were still living out in the fields, which was not the case, I should say, in the wintertime. One of the other things that I would bring to bear here in relation to the timing is back to that census. If you look at the fact that a census was being required with the Roman sense of organization, it would have been ludicrous for them to have a census in the middle of winter. City planning was and organization was one of their strengths. Understanding how to organize and orchestrate people and governments, this was all part of their strength. And so for them to order a census in the dead of winter, it would have defeated the purpose. Temperatures dropped below freezing around Jerusalem. The roads would have been muddy, and there would have been rains and showers and even occasional snow. It would have been a terrible time for people to travel, and it would have not made sense. Some of the authors actually talk about this, address this. For example, Christmas at Bethlehem by Cunningham Geikie. It's a book the title is Holy Days and Holidays, under the little heading of Christmas at Bethlehem. And he talks about how snow is not uncommon at Jerusalem in the winter months, and the rain, etc., etc. So no rational Roman official would have scheduled a census in the winter. For an agrarian society like Judea in the first century, a census in the autumn when the crops would have been gathered in would have made much more sense. And frankly, another point in that regard is the fact that, as I mentioned, it was around, certainly we can say, we can't say this unequivocally, but we certainly are in the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, which also would have impacted the busyness of Jerusalem, the population of Jerusalem, and impacted and had been part of the reason why it would have been crowded in Bethlehem and that type of thing. So we got different factors involved, but those are a couple in regard to the winter time not being the time of the birth of Christ, but indeed it was earlier in the fall. So we talked a little bit about the shepherds here and the timing of his birth, and let's read what we read about the shepherds here in Luke chapter 2 and verse 8. So we read verse 8, how they were living at this time. They were shepherds living in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. And behold, we read, an angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were greatly afraid. So we have one of these miraculous events that surrounded the birth of Christ, and we should not be, afraid of actually reading and acknowledging and really wondering at what a miraculous event this was, and how dramatic this was. I think it's important that we read this and we think about it, and we think what it would have been like to be there, and what this was all about. Sometimes because this, because this is related to or brought into play with Christmas and the pagan Christmas celebrations around us, perhaps we can sort of shy away from focusing on this, and we shouldn't. This was a dramatic miracle. The verse 10, the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which will be to all people. For there is born to you this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord." So remember, Bethlehem was nearby Jerusalem, considered to be part of the environs of Jerusalem. And so that's why this statement could be made. He says, verse 12, "And this will be the sign to you. You will find a babe wrapped in swaddling cloths lying in a manger." So we continue in verse 13. "And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host praising God and saying, 'Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men.'" This was a dramatic event. This was a focus of history. You just imagine how long God the Father, Jesus Christ, the Word, how long they waited after the plans had been laid for this event to happen. What a dramatic thing it was. I think it's hard for us to even comprehend how does it, I'm looking forward to at some point when we're spirit beings for God to explain how the Word became flesh. We can, in our little puny ant minds, we can try to come up with a comprehension of it, but is it really possible for us to comprehend something that we can read about? Certainly with our physical human minds, we can think about it, but really what that means, until we're spirit beings, I just feel like we're not grasping what that is all about to the fullest degree. And so what a miracle this was. So verse 15, "So it was, when the angels had gone away from them into heaven, that the shepherds said to one another, 'Let us now go to Bethlehem and see this thing which has come to pass.'" So they knew where to go, which the Lord, verse 15, "which the Lord has made known to us. And they came with haste, and they found Mary and Joseph and the babe lying in a manger." We're going to address that word here in a moment. We've seen it a couple of times. "When they had seen him, they made widely known the saying which was told them concerning this child. And all those who heard it marveled at those things which were told them by the shepherds. But Mary kept all these things and pondered them in her heart." She was still trying to deal with the reality of giving birth to the Son of God. Then the shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things that they had heard and seen as it was told them. So we see after this, verse 21, we're going to read a little bit more here. "When 8 days were completed for the circumcision of the child, his name was called Jesus," is the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. And we see here how verse 22, "When the days of purification according to the law of Moses were completed, they brought him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord." So now you're talking about some time passing. You're talking about a significant amount of time passing. Now I think at this point, let's go back and let's just address this issue of being born in a manger, and in verse 7, this statement about no room for them at the inn. We've grown up hearing the account that the inn in Bethlehem was full. There was no room available, so here they were in a stable, and Christ was born in this stable that we find depicted in a typical Christmas nativity scene that you see on somebody's lawn or in front of a public building or something. But really, there's more to the story. Now, remember, the New Testament was originally written in Greek, and the Greek word translated in here is kataluma. The transliteration in English would be Kataluma, and it means a place of rest. It usually is referring to a guest room. In fact, Luke uses this very same word when he's referring to a guest room and not an inn. Luke 22 and verse 11, I'll give you the reference, when Christ said to his disciples, "Then you shall say to the master of the house, the teacher says to you, where is the kataluma, or the guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples. So it was referring to, in this case, not an inn as we might think of an inn or a motel, but it was actually the Passover. It was the same word that was used for the Passover location, a guest room where he could eat the Passover. In fact, if you look at in the Gospel of Luke and read through, there's a different Greek word that Luke uses when he writes about an actual inn. And it's not the word kataluma. We find in Luke chapter 10, I believe, it's Luke 10 and verse 34, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And there Christ mentions that the injured man in the story was taken to an inn. And here, in this case, Luke uses the word pandokion. Kion. I'll spell it for you if you want to note it down. Or appreciate Milt Hadley taking. I'm sorry. Milt Hadley does the quizzes for us, but my mind is going. It'll come to me in just a second here. Rich Linehan. All I could think of is Bulldog, because he likes Bulldogs. And so I was thinking Bulldog Linehan. Well, Rich Linehan. Sorry, Rich. But appreciate Rich taking notes for us. And he always looks up the words and makes sure the spelling is correct and all that. So I appreciate that. But the Greek word that Christ uses for the inn in the story of the Good Samaritan is pandokion. So it's spelled Pandokheion. That was the normal word for an inn. And so if you look at the Arabic, for example, and the Syriac versions of the New Testament, which do reflect more of a sort of a Middle Eastern context, actually the word kataluma is translated in those versions as a guest room. There's a Middle Eastern and New Testament scholar whose name is Kenneth Bailey, and he wrote an article in the Bible and the Bible and Spade, which is an archaeological journal, and the title was "The Manger and the Inn: The Cultural Background of Luke 2, verse 7." Typical detail-oriented archaeological type of article. But here's what he says. He says, this translation of the word as inn is a product of our Western heritage. Young's literal translation, for example, uses the term guest chamber instead of an inn. And so note then the word is often, let me read what the Young's literal translation says. It says this of Luke 2 and verse 7. Says this: she brought forth her son, the firstborn, and wrapped him up and laid him down in the manger, because there was not for them a place in the guest chamber. So note also the word translated place or room. So instead of room and the inn, in fact, as a little aside, inns of that time did not actually often have individual rooms, and so the reference is really more similar to space, and so the idea here is it was a guest room in a particular house. Okay, so now so we think of this idea of sort of a hotel or Holiday Inn or something like this, but let's go a little bit further, because when we find kataluma used in the Gospels, typically we find that not only is it a sort of a guest chamber as opposed to something in a hotel, but it's typically in some type of a private home. Remember that even at that time, in fact, I have another quote that is from let's see here, I think it's from International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, and it says this: inns, let me read here, generally speaking, inns had a bad reputation. This ill repute of public inns, together with the Semitic spirit of hospitality, led the Jews and the early Christians to recommend the keeping of an open house for the benefit of strangers. So, and not only that, but also commercial, let's say, inns that were more of the type of thing that you'd stay, like we read of the Good Samaritan issue. That type of place was typically, because of commercial reasons, obviously along major routes. Bethlehem, though, was a small town in the upper mountains of Judea, and so there was no major Roman road passing through it. It was a small, say, insignificant village, and so it's doubtful that an actual inn ever existed there. So what am I saying by all this? Is that the more accurate way of thinking of this is more along the lines of that there was no room in the guest chamber, no room in the guest chamber. And again, remember that Bethlehem was Joseph's ancestral home. That's why he was going there. So most likely he had relatives there. And remember that it was not that far from where Mary was familiar, because remember when Elizabeth, she actually had stayed with Elizabeth not too long before that. Her cousin Elizabeth, back in the first chapter, we read verse 39 and 40, how Mary had lived with her for a while, and it wasn't that far away from Bethlehem where she had stayed. So probably in this situation, oh, the other thing is this. I wanted to add one other note about this. Most times people think of Joseph and Mary sort of hurriedly arriving into Bethlehem, her going into labor, and they rush to an inn. There's no vacancies, so they go to a stable, and she gives birth in this manger. But if you look at Luke chapter 2 here, verses 4, 5, 6, in this section, actually verse 6, it says the days were completed for her while they were there. The days were completed for her to be delivered. So she went into labor after they had already been in Bethlehem for some days. And they must have already been lodging somewhere in Bethlehem when her birth pangs began. And so they were probably in a house, that of Joseph's relatives, and so as opposed to some roadside inn like is oftentimes described. Now, so you might still be asking, well, why were they sent out to a stable then? If that's the case, if what I'm talking about is accurate, then why were they sent out to a stable that's described here? Well, no, that's actually not the case. Let me read something from the Archaeological Study Bible that sheds some background. Here's what it says. The manger was the feeding trough of the animals. This is the only indication that Jesus was born in a stable. Continuing from the Archaeological Study Bible, very early tradition suggests that his birthplace was a cave, perhaps being used as a stable. Continuing, Justin Martyr in the 2nd century AD stated that Jesus' birth took place in a cave close to the village. Over this traditional manger site, the Emperor Constantine and his mother Helena constructed the Church of the Nativity. So, okay, what can we make of all that? Well, note this, that it's the only thing that gives any indication of a stable is actually this issue of a manger. But under mangers, this is not like a stable attached to an Old West inn or something like that. That's not what it's saying. It's actually the manger. What is the question then is what is a manger? Well, a typical Judean house of that day consisted of an area near the door, often with a dirt floor, where the animals were kept. The family's animals were kept at night, so they wouldn't be stolen or maybe gobbled up by a passing wolf or something. And their body heat would actually help warm the home on cool nights. The family would live and sleep more in sort of a raised portion of the room, same room, set back from the door. And there was also usually a guest room, either upstairs on another floor, a second floor, or adjoining the family common room on the lower floor. And typically the lower area near the door had a manger for food and water or water for the animals. And so here's what Eric F. Bishop, who's an expert in Middle East culture, here's what he wrote. He said that the birth of Christ probably took place in one of the Bethlehem houses, with the lower section provided for the animals, with mangers hollowed in stone, the raised area being reserved for the family. Such a manger being immovable, filled with crushed straw, would do duty for a cradle. An infant might even be left in safety, especially if swaddled, when the mother was absent on typical business. Another Middle Eastern authority, his name is Gustav Dahlmann, writes this: in the East today, the dwelling place of man and beast is often in one and the same room. It is quite the usual thing among the peasants for the family to live, eat, and sleep on a kind of raised terrace in the one room of the house, while the cattle, particularly donkeys and oxen, have their place below on the actual floor near the door. This part sometimes is continued along the terrace as a kind of a low vault. On this floor, the mangers are fixed either to the floor or to the wall at the edge of the terrace. Now, this is completely unfamiliar to us. Completely bizarre for us, but this is the way. This was not offensive to them. The animals were taken out each day. I mean, this is similar to, I guess, my background in thinking of living in Thailand. I can remember this very clearly in upcountry areas where oftentimes animals were kept below. That typically in upcountry areas, the house was up off the ground on pillars, and the family would sleep up above, and then and there might be rooms, there might be some division of rooms, but just bamboo dividers were all there were. But underneath, that would keep the animals at night, and it kept them safe. They were able to keep an eye on them. Dogs barked if anybody came around, and it was just the way it was done. And if so, it sounds very familiar to me from even more modern times in areas of Asia and rural areas. So so let's summarize then. A more realistic view of what occurred with Christ's birth, according to the custom of the time, is that the manger was actually this stone, very solid, fixed place that hay could be put in and they could eat from. It was not something that was a dirty, filthy thing. It was actually cleaned out, and the hay was put in there, and it would have made a very solid place for him for the baby to be put. And this could have involved a cave, but that's only because some houses were built over caves. And maybe that cave thing, we don't know if that's accurate or not. In fact, some commentators will say that whole cave idea was that actually came from the Persian myth about the sun god Mithras, who was supposedly born in a cave. And so that idea from Justin Martyr and so that and the other one that I mentioned, that might have been something that was just tradition, and it came from even pagan sources. So by going through this and realizing, okay, what we were talking about here, there was not an inn like in a motel, but instead it was a guest area, and it was this manger was a typical place that was used for putting a baby. And it actually it was more like a family common room I'm sorry, it was like if possible, they would put people not in the family common room, but in an area adjacent to it. And so that's the idea. So I hope that gives a little bit of background to to what we're talking about here, and it shows how wrong the typical image is. And we're going to, in the last 15 minutes, we're going to talk about another part of the story that is usually twisted around and is not accurate, and that is the wise men. Okay, so let's read here. Let's go back to the account of Matthew. Okay, let's go back to Matthew chapter 2. Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to bring out about that. No, okay, let's read in Matthew chapter 2. Now, after Jesus was born, verse 1, in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. And note that one of the things we find here is this phrase, King of the Jews, is something very specific here to Matthew in this place, not typical in the Gospels when you read the other Gospels. So it was a focus here, and Herod did not miss this. Remember, Herod was paranoid about being overthrown, and so the news of a new Jewish king being born was not welcome news. In fact, I mean, he knew the certainly the traditions and the prophecies relating to the Messiah. And we read here in verse 4 and 5 how he inquired about these prophecies. Verse 3, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Oh, I know what I want to mention too is normally the announcement of a new king accompanied the death announcement of the old king, the previous king. So when there's this announcement of a new king, you can imagine, or King of the Jews, you can imagine that this made Herod very nervous. And so verse 3, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. So the news was all over the place. And when he gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And so they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet. So they pointed out to him the prophecies of old, and this didn't help matters any. Didn't make him feel any more comfortable. They said to him, verse 6, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, and again, note that it's wise men. Is it 3 wise men? No, it doesn't say 3. There's a reason why 3, the number 3 is used, and it's certainly not kings either. That's again a myth, something that was added and twisted later. It says these wise men. Some actually call them magi or magicians or astrologers. And remember, in these ancient times, sometimes wise men, magi, astrologers, those who studied the stars, the signs, those who had gifts of understanding of the signs of the times, all this type of thing. It was all sort of mixed together. There was certainly a lot of paganism involved, but they did study the stars. And in ancient times, that was much more of a fascination of people today. We don't even look at the stars today. We don't. Most of us, if we were asked about the Big Dipper, we might know where it is. Little Dipper, maybe not so much. Orion or other Cassiopeia or other constellations, we have a hard time finding them. We just don't pay attention to the stars because we we live our life with indoor lighting, and we turn the TV on when it gets dark or whatever. We don't study the stars. We don't think about the stars. But this was a different time. So remember Daniel and his three companions. Who were they placed with? They were placed with the wise men, the same sort of grouping here. So who were these people? We don't find we find lots of myths, and we find lots of ideas and theories, but what we read specifically here is simply they were wise men from the east. If you hear different stories about who they were, whatever, be careful. Just focus first of all, and with surety on what it says here in the scriptures. Don't just believe everything that you hear about who they were and from other different sources. Let's just focus on what we read here. We do see that Herod, when he had secretly called these men, determined from them what time the star appeared. So apparently there was some sign in the heavens, and I have an article here that talks about the different potential heavenly signs that it may have been referring to, and there's all kinds of conjecture about what it might have been. For example, in 7 BC, there was the triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in the Pisces constellation. In February of 6 BC, there was a near conjunction of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. So some say, oh, that was what that's talking about. It's interesting. You can actually do a little bit of research and try to find what different people propose would have been the sign that these men would have seen. But really, there's nothing that's beyond conjecture. And most of at least the research that I've done, most of the potential, let's say, dramatic events in the heavens actually are in different years and don't really help us out any. So, again, ultimately, this was a miracle, and we have to be careful when we try to. It's like trying to find in history the record of Joshua's long day. There's a popular story that if you look at the story, you realize it was not accurate. It's not accurate. There's no physical explanation for Joshua's long day. It was a miracle, and just like this is a miracle, and we have to. This is the same, the blood red moon business that there's so much hype about here over the last year. This is again typical of something that happens in the heavens that people will try to whip up enthusiasm for, but recognize there are things that are of the heavens that are naturally, regularly occurring phenomenon, even if the regularity may only be like this one triple conjunction happens about once every 900 years. Well, when God works a miracle in the skies, it's a miracle. When God opened the Red Sea, it wasn't a tide that he just happened to catch at the right time. So anyway, I think we can look at it first and foremost as a miracle that was not natural. It was something that was unexpected. It was something that was dramatic, something that got their attention. And so this is why they were coming here. And so he said, verse 8, and he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the young child, and when you have found him, bring back word to me that I may come and worship him also. Well, he was being devious because he didn't want to worship him. He wanted to kill him as a potential contender. So when they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. So this is a miraculous event. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they had come to the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. These are three things that you might say that depicted in symbolism depicted royalty. The gold was a gift for royalty. Frankincense was an incense that was connected with the priesthood, the temple sacrifices, and certainly was foreshadowing the fact that Jesus Christ would serve as our high priest and that he would give himself as the perfect sacrifice to pay the penalty for the sins of all mankind. And myrrh was even more sobering. When a person died, myrrh was the perfuming agent that was wrapped with the body to help cover up the smell, the stench of the rotting, decaying body. So in this case, it pointed to the fact that he would die. So these three gifts are the only indication of the number of men. That's where this idea of three comes from these three gifts. But it doesn't say there were three. It only says literally that they were men. They were plural. It was not one. It was plural. Verse 12. Then, being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed for their own country another way. So we continue the story. Verse 13. When they had departed. Oh, by the way, yes. The reason I read a little bit further back in Luke is to understand that there were things. There was a period of time that was going was going on here. There was a period of time of purification, many days, weeks, that would have been involved for Mary. Here, for example, verse 8, we don't read about an infant in a manger. We read about a child, a young child, not a baby, but a young child. So how long was it before these men came and saw the little child, the newborn? Well, it was not the first day or the second day or the third day. In this case, it doesn't say newborn. I mean, it actually could have been sometime within the first year. It could have been months. It could have been, actually, if you look at it, it could have been up to even up to 2 years, according to what we see here with the command of Herod to kill all the little ones under the age of 2 years. So the whole vision, the whole picture that is given in Christmas celebrations of a stable with this trough that is, and they're pushed out into the sort of the outer edge of the village. They're not welcome at the hotel. They go up to the desk clerk and, sorry, we have no rooms for you. There's no room at the inn. And you go out to go to the stable that's out behind the inn. It's all wrong. It's all completely wrong. And then the idea that they have after the nenext day, as the baby is born, the idea that there's these three kings that come and present gifts to this little baby and all that, it's completely wrong. This was when it was a child. So verse 13, let's just read and conclude here. Verse 13, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I bring you word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. So we see here, verse 14, when he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the Lord. He says, verse 15, saying, Out of Egypt I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry, and he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its districts from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men. Then it was fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, A voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation, weeping, and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted, for they all know more. Verse 19, Now when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Arise, take the young child and his mother, go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the young child's life are dead. And so he arose, took the young child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea instead of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned by God in a dream, he turned aside into the region region of Galilee. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. So that brings us to chapter 3, which then recounts the story of John. Back in Luke, if we go back to Luke, we see likewise, just want to read the last few verses here. By the way, I'm getting a few messages. I got one message that the individual was not able to log into the channel for the Bible study tonight, so I'm sorry about that. Perhaps if you don't mind, if it went fine as far as the sound and the even the video there, just send me a quick email if you get a chance here later on tonight, or when you at your convenience, to let me know that it's coming through okay. I'd appreciate it, because I want to make sure that what we're doing is worthwhile, and it's not it's not technically not working. That doesn't help matters. So just the last few verses here. So we're in Luke chapter 2, and we read we read verse 21 and 22 and 23 and 24, where Christ was circumcised, and then later, after the time of purification, how we read verse 22, verse 23, verse 24, that he was brought to Jerusalem and presented. And then verse 25, we read, Behold, there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon, and this man was just and devout, waiting for the consolation of Israel. And the Holy Spirit was upon him. It's interesting that you find this word, the consolation of Israel. It's the same word that's used, I believe, in Mark 15, the paraklesis. When we read about the sense of a comforter, one who would bring consolation. Here it's prophesied here right from the time of his birth. And verse 26, it had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not see death before he had seen the Lord's Christ. So he came by the Spirit into the temple. He was inspired to come to the temple. And when the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him according to the custom of the law, he took him up in his arms and blessed God and said, Lord, now you are letting your servant depart in peace, according to your word, for my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all the peoples, a light to bring revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel. And Joseph and his mother marveled at those things which were spoken of him. And Simeon blessed them and said to Mary his mother, Behold, this child is destined for the fall and rising of many in Israel, and for a sign which will be spoken against. Yes, a sword will pierce through your own soul also, that the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed. And we read here verse 36 then, finally. Verse 36, there was one Anna, a prophetess, the daughter of Phanuel. She was of great age and had lived with a husband 7 years from her virginity. This woman was a widow of about 84 years who did not depart from the temple, but served God with fastings and prayers night and day. And coming in that instant, she gave thanks to the Lord and spoke of him to all those who look for redemption in Jerusalem. So there was this unusual excitement, but yet curiosity, and in the part of Joseph and Mary, a sense of not being quite sure what to make of who their son was. What a dramatic story. Well, tonight we've taken a little bit of time to go through the stable, the manger, the room, at the end theas, the wise men, the shepherds, the timing of his birth, and a little bit just to recap the census. There's unfortunately so much misinformation and myth that goes along with the Christmas story that it obscures the truths of what really happened and how it happened. And unfortunately, those myths are sort of stamped on our cultural psyche by songs and decorations and everything about this fall celebration. So tonight, hopefully, that has reminded you of the truth of what really happened at the time of Christ's birth. Thanks very much for spending this hour with me this evening. Everybody have a great evening. We'll see you next week. Good night, everybody.